Howdy, y'all. Welcome back to Volume 2 of What Did Confucius Actually Say? In our last episode on Confucius, we talked about the fact that his real name was Kong, and that he is known as Master Kong in Chinese literature. Our last volume on Master Kong was fairly introductory in nature, but there are many more sayings and interactions in the Analects that we need to consider. Master Kong lived well into his 70s, so he had a long life to draw from. And, as we've already seen, Chinese civilization, as we all learned in school, throughout antiquity, had a level of technology that was at the same level and often higher than what we see in Western civilization in antiquity. Now, part of this difference has to do with just brute force numbers. In our last volume on Confucius, we explored an ancient China from 500 BC, and we could see that Chinese civilization was, at the time, heavily populated and highly urbanized. By the standards of 500 BC. Now, if you and I were to get into a time machine and go visit Confucius, we would perceive a very sparse agrarian population. But we're coming from our time period of endless mountains of people with loud and hungry mouths packed into steel and concrete and drywall cages. We come from an odd place in human history. But I do think that the primary advantage that Chinese civilization had over Europe in its early history could be summed up in just one word: stability. China had these long periods where large concentrated populations of people lived peacefully and productively in close proximity, with good communication in terms of safe roads, and an established system for mailing letters. China had this, and had more of it, and more consistently than in the West. Let's consider Greco-Roman civilization, what you might consider peak civilization in antiquity, before the Middle Ages. You could claim that maybe from about 80 AD to 180 AD, the Mediterranean basin was one of those continuous zones of law and order, with some respect for free trade, enforcement of contracts, safe commerce, secure private property, and a mailing system. Citizens could travel and communicate freely, much to the chagrin of the Roman imperial government, because that is precisely how Christianity spread so far so quickly. Unfortunately for them, the Apostle Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus, happened to be a Roman citizen, despite his Jewish ancestry. There's a story behind that, but we'll save that for one of the episodes about Western history. But just know that likely Paul's ancestors were prisoners of war that were taken during the time of Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, in his original conquest of Judea that established Herod as the client king over the Jews. And just so you know, Herod was not Jewish at the time. He had to publicly convert to Judaism in order to take the throne. So I don't know about you, but that definitely gives him more of the odor of a political puppet rather than an actual king. But that period from 80 AD to 180 AD is incredibly influential on all of what remains of Western history. In the West, we talk about the Middle Ages. Well, middle of what? The term Middle Ages came around the same time as the Renaissance. Renaissance, which is just French for rebirth. Okay. Rebirth of what? Early modern Europeans began to see this peak of antiquity, 80 AD to 180 AD, roughly, as something that needed to be recovered, or restored, or brought back. And so they looked at the intervening years of all the Germanic kings and fighting over farmlands to force peasants to work. Germanic culture and all of its semi-chaotic tribalism and obsession over oaths and whatnot. They found the Greco-Roman world to be something more systematic and promising for the future. And so that is what was reborn in the Renaissance. The dream of antiquity. And this dream of antiquity was one stretch of time that was similar to multiple stretches of time in Chinese history. In the West, we experienced this peak of stability and connection and population under reasonably good leadership. And it appears that China enjoyed stretches of time like that much more frequently and earlier in its history. And so throughout Chinese history, there have been several stretches of extreme prosperity and stability and connection. Times when China was safe and unified and enjoyed all the same benefits as Rome at its peak. A single system of laws, measurements, free travel, quick, easy, reliable mail, relatively high levels of literacy compared to the uncivilized world, not compared to us, of course. Their rates of literacy would be extremely low by our standards. But remember that literacy and education were more focused on in the East than in the West. Now, maybe this had to do with the fact that in the West, we generally dealt with alphabets that were used to represent sounds on paper. Each little squiggle represented a sound your mouth could make, and you learned somewhere between 15 and 20 of those things, and you could write your language. No such luck in China. By 500 BC, they had already firmly planted themselves on the track of using ideographs, little drawings that represented ideas and not just sounds. And so you couldn't get away with 15 to 20, more like 1,500 to 2,000, and in modern China, 10 to 20,000. And so to have any level of literacy at all with this writing system, you have to have a more thorough education program than what you see in the schools of grammar and rhetoric in the Greco-Roman world. And you also begin to see more thought and consideration about how to educate people and what it meant to be educated. Because remember, as I talked about in another episode, our Western word, civilization, comes from a Latin word that describes the process of building cities and adapting to living in a city. And so the idea of streets and buildings and high population density are what immediately come to mind when we're talking about civilization. Now remember, the word for civilization, the equivalent in Chinese culture, is 文化. And you could argue that one translation, one quirky but accurate translation of 文化 is litericization. In other words, the Chinese saw their writing system, and by extension, their education system, as central to maintaining a society with high population levels where people interact in a way that is prosperous and safe. And so, amongst all this debate about how to train the youth and what are you supposed to learn, Chinese culture produced some thought on this subject that I think the West could have used a little more of. And the next saying from Confucius is one of my favorites, and it relates to this subject of, well, what does it mean to know things, and how do you learn things? And so let's hear Master Kong tell us a little bit about how should we study. How should we approach studying a new subject and thinking about it? Let's hear.
The master said,
"To study without thinking is futile. To think without studying is dangerous."
So now I think you can see why I like this statement. I'm a big supporter of book learning, as they say, but it's important to keep it in balance with practical understanding of the world. This dichotomy between thinking for yourself and then learning facts is an important distinction. In the West, our philosophical tradition has often focused on how these two blur together, and how a fact can be a product of interpretation that is the result of thinking in the absence of concrete practical proof. Aristotle points to a similar balance, not exactly the same, but similar. Aristotle's balancing act is not between introspection and learning, like Confucius. Aristotle points to a balancing act between theoretical knowledge and practical real-world knowledge. Aristotle says that if you want to move forward, you have to advance using both, kind of like two legs, the two legs of human progress. One leg is theoretical knowledge, for example, trying to figure out what the heck neutrons are, and then practical real-world knowledge, which would be, okay, now that we know what they are, let's build a gigantic, dangerous bomb. Let's build weapons based on our knowledge of neutrons. Well, there you go. Those are the two legs of progress, according to Aristotle. Because without the theoretical underpinnings of something, without the math, without the paperwork, it's very hard to build anything. But then at the same time, the guys who are pushing the pencils are useless without the guys who can actually do the welding and the wiring. Now, I think that if you consider what Confucius is saying, and if you consider what Aristotle said, that seems to point to the fact that the most effective people on Earth have a bit of both. These freakish monsters of competence are people who have one foot in both worlds. people who can do both. So, who are some good examples of that? Well, when I think of a monster of competence, one of those freakishly gifted and able human beings, I guess I'm not very creative in that because I'll go with one that might be a little cliched now. Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong, the American astronaut, there were some odd and unfortunate things about his career, and I believe that some of the things that he learned about the moon during the moonshot and the things that he was forced to keep secret when he came home bothered him deeply. And I think that you can see that his emotional reaction to being the first human to set foot on the moon just doesn't really add up. Sure, he was a very introverted, emotional, quiet guy, very connected to friends and family, but it still doesn't explain his strangely morose behavior immediately after the moon landing in 1969. Please go watch the press conference by Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin when they first emerged from quarantine that they had to stay in after re-entering the Earth's atmosphere and crashing into the ocean after landing on the moon. Now, why was Neil Armstrong chosen? I think it's because he proved that he was one of those freakish monsters of competence. And one example occurred in 1966 during the Gemini missions. And it was Armstrong's first trip to space. He flew up in a capsule designed just for 2 astronauts, a very small, cramped capsule. And the purpose of the Gemini missions was to train the astronauts and prepare the engineering plans for the actual trip to the moon. And so the mission in 1966 that Armstrong and his partner were on was to go into orbit and dock with an empty remote vehicle called the Agena. Based on its spelling, in proper Greek it would have been Agena, but it appears that the people in the program called it the Agena. And so the Agena was in orbit. The Gemini spacecraft was supposed to go into orbit, dock with the Agena, to prove the mechanism and methods for docking vehicles in orbit. That had never been done. Something that you kind of need to be able to do well before you start using multiple stage vehicles to get to the moon. And so Armstrong and his partner dock with the Agena successfully, but then something goes wrong. They start rotating end over end. So in other words, you have to imagine the cone-shaped Gemini spacecraft connected to this rod-shaped object in space. And this long combination of vehicles is tumbling end over end. And so you can imagine the G-forces being experienced by the guys who are being slammed against the back of that cone in the Gemini space capsule. Now, what had happened was that a control thruster on the Gemini spacecraft had short-circuited and was just in the open position. And so it was spraying a small jet of gas into space. But over time, that was enough to increase the momentum. But at first, Mission Control was concerned that the wayward thruster that was causing the tumbling was coming from the Agena spacecraft. And so the first thing that the Gemini pilots did was eject the Agena so that the connection was broken. And they thought that, well, that way, if the thruster that was locked in the open position was on the Agena would start to tumble faster and faster and faster, but the Gemini spacecraft would not be subject to continued angular acceleration. And so they undocked from the Agena, but then the Gemini spacecraft started tumbling end over end even faster. In fact, it got to the point where their rotation was 1 tumble per second. So imagine that you're in this capsule, and there's a thruster in the nose of the cone that is in the open position, and it's spraying a jet of gas into space that is causing your spacecraft to tumble end over end. And once it gets to 1 tumble per second, the G-forces become a problem. And at that point, the 2 astronauts started to have trouble seeing because of blood flow to their eyes. And of course, they both knew that the next step was loss of consciousness. So here is Neil Armstrong in space. He can't see. G-forces are pinning his head and his arms against his seat. At this point, most humans would realize, oh boy, I'm about to go unconscious and then I'm going to die. I'm never going to wake up. This orbit will decay, and they're going to fish the remains of this capsule out of the ocean. Well, the thing is, Neil Armstrong was also a very good engineer. And not only was he a physical specimen who could maintain concentration and consciousness longer than a normal human, he also knew the wiring of the spacecraft. They say that Neil Armstrong would develop these things called one-pagers, where every aspect of the spacecraft was reduced to a page of material that he would memorize. And so he did the thinking. He kept his head. Despite all of what was going on, he realized, well, if the tumbling accelerated after ejecting the Agena, that means the thruster that's out of control has to be on the Gemini spacecraft. Now, he was not able to reach up to the control panel to try to turn off the thruster because he knew the thing had activated without being asked to begin with and was an electrical short. And so the only solution was to find the fuse to that circuit, pull it, and that would shut off the thruster. So that is precisely what Neil Armstrong did, just using his memory of the layout of the wiring of the spacecraft just before losing consciousness at a point where he could no longer see. He pulled the fuse and stopped the acceleration. Now, of course, when you're tumbling in a vacuum, stopping the acceleration is just step 1. In a vacuum, they would continue to tumble at 1 tumble per second forever until the astronauts were dead. But Neil Armstrong then was able to, without using his eyes, find and activate a separate thruster control system that was not supposed to be activated yet until after this phase of the mission. Now, Neil Armstrong, by activating that, he required a mission abort at that point, but it was the only way to slow the tumbling down and stop the spacecraft from spinning and keep the astronauts alive. And so, beyond all reasonable expectations, Neil Armstrong saved his life and that of his partner, and the Gemini missions, and, you could argue, the lunar missions, the Apollo program, all in one step. Just because the man was a magnificent athlete, he had the great gut instincts of a test pilot, and he was also a good scientist and engineer in his own right. Another example of Neil Armstrong's competence showed why he was a very good choice to be the person who piloted the lunar lander and would be the first person to set foot on the moon. During the final descent stage, due to a variety of small errors, by the time the lunar module, the little bug-looking thing that they finally landed on the moon in, by the time that thing was in its descent toward the surface, they encountered a field of boulders that would create a dangerous area to land in. Neil Armstrong kept the lunar module flying much longer than what they had anticipated on paper. And in fact, he had less than 30 seconds of fuel left. And so he used his gut, his experience, his nerve as a test pilot, that even under all that pressure, he was going to choose a good landing spot. And he just knew down to the second how much fuel he had before they would just fall out of the sky and crash into the lunar surface and die. The amount of clear thinking this person can do under the most enormous pressure you can imagine is just mind-blowing. And the fact that he was such a brilliant engineer, while at the same time, this peak human who could actually fly the device better than other humans at the same time, was pretty impressive. And so it makes sense that he was the guy that they chose to go set foot on the moon and then come back and keep all the secrets about the fact that there was tons of stuff already up there and chemical rockets were obsolete by the 40s in reality. Neil had to fly these tube-like, clumsy chemical rockets better than most humans, and I still salute him for that, even though electrogravitics could have gotten us to the moon in seconds. Now, one thing I can't help but notice about Confucius is that I think he may have been frustrated about the lack of practical experience that he ended up gaining in his life. He did have appointments, and there are stories about decisions that he made. But it does appear that for most of his life, he was on the book end. He was the literature guy. He was the guy who knew the history. And here, in this next passage, we're encountering a Confucius from his younger years. By middle age, Confucius had come to prominence, and his disciples received political appointments. But until he was about 50 years old, he was regarded primarily as a theoretical, academic type guy. A learned guy, but not an up-and-coming functionary of the imperial system. And so the next analect reflects a conversation from Confucius's younger years before he had any appointments. And we'll see his attitude about how learned, bookish people relate to the government. Does everybody participate in politics? Even the guy in the library at 3 a.m.? As opposed to the bodyguard who watches the government officials during their meetings? Who is the government? Do we all matter? Let's hear.
Someone said to Confucius,
"Master, why don't you join the government?"
The master said,
In the documents, it is said, only cultivate filial piety and be kind to your brothers, and you will be contributing to the body politic. This is also a form of political action. One need not necessarily join the government.
And so in this analect, we see that Confucius politicizes life itself. He believes that the foundation of the government is the regulation of private life. That's a stark difference from how we think of it today. Because Confucius doesn't even believe that this regulation of private life should come from a government. He thinks that in the best societies, the government doesn't regulate that sort of thing, even though it's super important. That would be modern China, by the way. Modern China has developed AI systems using facial recognition and whatnot that monitor their civilians en masse as they go about their lives. But that's another story. That's very different from what Confucius would have approved of. In Confucius's system, this regulation of people's private lives was very strict, but the oversight was dispersed among the watchful gentlemen and their virtuous wives and their orderly households. Confucius believed in a phrase that we'll hear soon, restraining people with ritual. So what does that mean, to restrain people with ritual? This all goes back to an old Chinese word that Confucius used, li, kind of like L-I, and you have to say that I sound with a very low tone. It's the third tone in Mandarin Chinese. So to give you an idea of how important the tonality is in Chinese, I like to think of the syllable that we would write as S and I, S-I. Now, in the first tone, that would be pronounced S, S, and that would be the Chinese word for silk or a thread of some kind. And it has a particular character that goes along with it. Then the fourth tone with that spelling would be pronounced S. So instead of S, we have S. And S means four, F-O-U-R, the numeral 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, number 4. Now, if you were to pronounce that with the third tone, 死, that would mean death. And that very much has its own distinct character. And so you have to be very careful because 死 is a thread, 死 is the number 4, and 死 is death. And so similarly, there's one pronunciation of li that kind of refers to logic or reason. This would be a different one, and it refers to the proper form of something. And so what Confucius means by a ritual would be the proper way to make tea for a guest, the proper colors to paint your house, how you dress for official functions. We think of those things as little nitpicks that basically, unless you're in the military, that kind of thing doesn't matter. But for Confucius, he thought this was essential. And he thought that this was how you achieved this dispersed private regulation of people's lives. And his belief was that the leaders and the ancestors of a community developed the rituals, and then they trained the youth on how to perform the rituals. And as they hand down this information, that is what keeps society in order and what keeps it going. And I'm sure most of us know that ancestor worship was a huge part of Confucianism and ancient China in general. Confucius seems to have a fairly simple metric for a successful society, and it doesn't seem to be GDP. It doesn't appear to be economic development. It appears to be a metric based on the virtuous behavior of each individual in the community, and then its persistence or its stability. I think Confucius saw the purpose of a community is to continue, and that the purpose of the people in the community is to pass down what came before to the next generation. The goal of life is to persist. The goal of life is to die and leave behind what's going to continue the community. And, of course, Confucius wasn't aware of how long modern humans had been on Earth, or life in general. But if we combine what Confucius knew with what we know now, we can see that each generation of our ancestors successfully reproduced in an unbroken chain over the course of about 4 billion years. That's kind of impressive. Not a single one of your ancestors died before reproducing. Every single one of your ancestors survived to reproduce, and at least one of those offspring went on to successfully reproduce in their stead. And Confucius thought that it was important for each generation to see their place in that unbroken chain. In other words, Confucius believed that without that context of where do we come from and who were our ancestors, we literally become immoral people. He thinks that understanding one's place is part of what it means to be virtuous. That if you don't know who your ancestors are, you're a bad person. That's putting it kind of strongly. I can't find an analect that says that explicitly, but I do think that a disregard for history or being ignorant of where your community came from would reflect not a lack of intellectual curiosity, which is the way we would frame it. Confucius would frame that as a lack of morality. He would say, you can't trust that person. A person who doesn't care about history doesn't care about morality because they're related. One comes from the other. How do you know what the right thing to do next is if you don't know what your ancestors have been doing for all the time before you were born? You're just going to guess based on your own personal life? So 20 years in the 21st century overrides everything that was learned in the previous 4 billion years, or in the previous 200,000, or the previous 2,000. So if you thought that maybe I overstated Confucius's position earlier, let's listen to this next analect where he is pretty clear that the connection that a community has to their past relates to their virtuous behavior in their future. Let's listen.
Master Zeng said,
When the dead are honored and the memory of a remote ancestor is kept alive, a people's virtue is at its fullest.
So the idea of going through life without understanding your history, without understanding the struggle of your ancestors, this was just plain evil to Confucius. I think there is some truth to this because of the attitude that grows out of this kind of study. Because people that think about their ancestors and the actions of their ancestors are automatically thinking about things like mortality, morality, their community and the other humans that are in it. They're thinking about their connection, how they plug into their history, and what legacy they're going to leave behind. And it leads you to think about, what are my duties in life? What should I be doing? Do I have any duty to this community? Well, I think that a rational person at some point will say, yeah, of course I do. The community is the only reason I have food to eat or that I know how to read. So I think we have to look at these rituals in the light that Confucius did. In other words, when he saw people placing little sacrifices or offerings at the tombs of ancestors, he is not seeing a servant bowing and scraping to their master to please the ego of their ancestors' spirit, to show how debased and obedient they are. Confucius would say that, no, it's just a small recognition that we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and that the only way to become giants ourselves is through our community, through family, through associations, societies, rulers, institutions. These are the things that live on after us. These are the things that are bigger than us. And I think Confucius would be annoyed by the interpretation that a person who is worshiping their ancestors is debasing themselves or seeing themselves as lesser than. And I think if we look at the analects closely, we can see that Confucius wants a society where virtue is enforced spontaneously and in this everyday, diffuse kind of way. He doesn't believe in big laws and institutions and threatening people with the death penalty. In other words, he's not Roman. Confucius thinks that the best society doesn't need compulsion. It wouldn't need legal threats. A virtuous, industrious people doesn't need economic incentives to do the right thing or the prudent thing. So Confucius thinks that the most important thing is this hunger for knowledge and virtue and true prosperity that is situated inside each individual. In other words, wealth is properly stored inside families and communities. Wealth should not be stored in institutions or nation states. And so, in this kind of government, you have to have the consent of the governed. Confucius is laying out the prescription for a very voluntary society. A voluntary society ruled by these learned, virtuous men. And so, how do these virtuous men manufacture this consent? How does Confucius expect the leaders to get people to follow their orders without threats, without economic incentives? Well, luckily for us, someone did ask Confucius that very question.
Duke Ai asked,
What should I do to win the hearts of the people?
Confucius replied,
Raise the straight and set them above the crooked, and you will win the hearts of the people. If you raise the crooked and set them above the straight, the people will deny you their support.
So here, Confucius is referring to what constitutional scholars might refer to as appointment powers. In our form of government, the executive branch has tremendous power to appoint people for all kinds of things. And the executive can use this power to reward people that the people love, or punish people that the people don't like. The executive can use the record and reputation and beliefs of the people they appoint, or officially honor, as a way to show himself or herself as the champion of the values of the people they want to lead. This whole discussion about how to gain the consent of the governed, in other words, how much of a dictator can I make myself without having to invest in hiring more goons and buying more guns and body armor? How do I get people to actually want to be my subjugated masses? Well, our old friend Niccolò Machiavelli, our Italian political thinker from the Renaissance, wrote a political treatise that we refer to as The Prince, Il Principe. Now, in Il Principe, Machiavelli wrote about this very question, about how to get the consent of the governed. And in particular, Machiavelli was wondering whether this would-be dictator should set out to be loved by the people or feared by the people. Could you be both? How does that work? Let's hear this quite different voice, Machiavelli, from almost 2,000 years after Confucius. Let's hear what he has to say.
Here a question arises. Whether it is better to be loved than feared, or the reverse. The answer is, of course, that it would be best to be both loved and feared. But since the two rarely come together, anyone compelled to choose will find greater security in being feared than in being loved. Love endures by a bond which men, being scoundrels, may break whenever it serves their advantage to do so. But fear is supported by the dread of pain, which is ever present.
All right, that's more like it. Welcome back to Western civilization, baby, where the dread of pain is ever present. We don't trust anybody over here. Now, I'm making a big deal about this distinction between Eastern and Western civilization, only because it matters a lot the farther back in time you go. The closer you get to the Ice Age, the more there is a real distinction between the East and the West in terms of human civilization. After all, Confucius had no clue who Homer or Achilles were, and the first Chinese emperor had no idea who Marcus Aurelius was. Now, in the 21st century, this distinction is very fuzzy and very uneven. It's getting pretty much useless in the 21st century. Basically, we have a kind of uneven global civilization now, with regional pockets of dissent. And what do I mean by regional pockets of dissent? I'm talking about places like Saudi Arabia or North Korea, where you have highly coercive governments that maintain a kind of leaky dam that tries to keep the global civilization out with varied success. And for example, culturally, politically, and economically, Tokyo is more aligned with London than it is with Beijing. So there is no big geographic wall that separates East and West now, thanks to technology. And so East and West, starting in the 20th century, slowly started to bleed into one another and cross boundaries and erase old barriers. And this will continue, of course. And what's interesting is that as East and West bleed together and recombined into one global human civilization, that means that it's more important than ever to look at people like Confucius or Machiavelli and see where they agree and disagree, because both East and West have always been trying to solve some of the same problems. In other words, if I'm a wealthy elite and I have a chateau or a castle or an enormous farm, and I need to keep the peasants working quietly so that I can finish my book of poems, how do I do that? And how do I do that without having to, once again, hire goons and have public executions and that sort of thing? How do I convince them to just work themselves to death so that I can buy my third home? I mean, I wouldn't want to have to do something as uncouth as beat someone or threaten them with violence. That would really put me out of my mood for my poems. And I wouldn't want to have to hire someone to do the beating for me. That's expensive. So, what methods should the elites use to obtain obedience from the peasantry? How do you get people to do what you want, even when they don't want to? Well, we know how to get obedience from the elites themselves. Blackmail works really well. But, they didn't know about the Caribbean, and Confucius didn't own any islands, so mass blackmail was not an option. So, how do you get obedience from the common man? What's the best method for that? Now, we know what the Romans thought, and as an extension, what Machiavelli thought. They literally believed in that old joke that became a meme that has the sign posted up in the workplace that says, "The beatings will continue until morale improves." That's pretty much what the Romans believed. They saw a nation-state as a ship, and the emperor was the captain. And when sailors got unruly, they had to be beaten with a cat o' nine tails on the deck in front of everybody. But what did Confucius think about this? what did Confucius actually say? Did he think you should go around threatening and beating people? Is this the Hagakure? Is he recommending that a gentleman carry a razor-sharp sword on his hip at all times in case someone disrespects him? As you might suspect, Confucius is a lot more laid back than that, and his prescription is interesting.
The master said,
If you lead them by political maneuvers and restrain them with punishments, the people will become cunning and shameless. If you lead them with virtue and restrain them with ritual, then they will develop a sense of shame and a sense of participation.
So, the plot thickens. Confucius is putting his cards on the table here. He's giving us his solution to the age-old chicken and egg question, one that Machiavelli touched on earlier. Are people cunning and shameless because they've been tricked by politicians and tortured and imprisoned? Or do politicians constantly lie and torture and imprison people because people are so cunning and so shameless that cold-blooded cruelty is the only way to lead them? What if our leaders are liars because only liars can lead liars? What if violent, cruel psychopaths end up in charge so often precisely because that's the only way you can rule cruel, violent psychopaths, is by finding the strongest and most violent psychopath and put them in charge? Is that the situation we're stuck in? Well, Confucius would say no. Confucius would say there's another way. Ritual. That's the magic word. And we're going to leave off here for today. But in the next episode on Confucius, we are going to talk about this concept of restraining people with ritual. The word ritual that we're using here is, as I said before, it's a translation of the Chinese word li, and it refers to the proper way of doing something, the proper way of inviting someone over to dinner, the proper way to dress for a meeting with the Duke, the proper way to write a letter. What kind of gift should you bring to a house dedication ceremony? Confucius believed that these simple acts and the form and the restrictions that we put on them formed the basis of a good society. That a good society was just a community where people practiced li, and a society without li was doomed to become a disgusting zoo that puts all the worst human behavior on full display. In other words, the society we have now. I would say that our society has no li, 我们没有li, and what I mean by that is that in our society, there's no proper way to do anything. There's no rule about texting that I can summon to shame some 20-year-old about the choice of emoji that they used when they texted me. Capitalization and spelling is not something we really concern ourselves with. And never mind writing and texting. There's no level of shaming you can really do to make anybody wear more clothing in general, or different clothing. In our society, we no longer agree that underwear is underwear. Underwear can be outerwear because in our society, everybody is different. Even though the science screams at us that no, we're not. We're all just combinations of the same 5 archetypes. People are not that different. We're depressingly similar. The marketers had me pegged a long time ago. Aging Gen X Austin hipster. That tells you all kinds of things about the products I buy, what kind of car I drive, what kind of music I listen to, what kind of movies I'm going to go see. Confucius would say that these little arbitrary rules about how to write or walk or talk or dress, he believed that humans could not get along without those rules. And more importantly, the rules are important because they allow you to spot who is the more sociable and conscientious person. And you can spot those people by how well they conform to those rules. And the more complex and voluminous the rules, the more of a hurdle it is to jump through, the easier it is to spot the people who can do it. It's a character test. For Confucius, looking at someone's wardrobe is a character test. Listening to someone's speech patterns for Confucius is a character test. And we're not talking about the size of their vocabulary. As we heard earlier, Confucius was not interested in eloquence. Confucius would be more impressed with saying the right greeting to the right person at the right time. Something like remembering the name of the gardener and asking about the health of his wife. Things like that. For Confucius, that's what it's all about. Furthering the ritual. Handing it down to the next generation through example. For Confucius, that was government. That's leadership. That's the core function of a society. Not some scroll where someone wrote down the Constitution, the parliamentary rules about how we're supposed to form our laws. We don't see it that way now. But maybe Confucius had a point. After all, as I pointed out, Chinese civilization did enjoy those periods of stability more often than in Europe or the Mediterranean. Maybe their focus on doing the basic stuff the right way and enforcing cultural uniformity was the actual trick. And maybe the West, with our focus on edge cases and the boundaries between belief and knowledge and the gray areas between facts and opinions, and also enforcing a kind of cultural atomism where the individual was central and sacred. Maybe the West made a mistake by going that direction. Maybe some of those cultural trends tended to trigger instability in the West that we didn't see in the East. But history is so messy. Human societies are so full of so many individual economic and even ecological variables that have their say. It's really hard to isolate one element and say, aha, this is the causal thread. This is why this is the way it is. That's pretty much impossible. We'll definitely look more into this next time. And in particular, we will talk more about Li, about Confucius's concept of ritual. And next time, we'll talk more about Confucius and his friend Yanhui and some other details about his life, the ones that we can dredge up out of the murky depths of history. And so, until next time, keep restraining yourself. Use rituals if you have to. Make up some new ones. Hand them down to the young people in your community. But until then, I'll talk to you later.